Incredibly interesting times when it comes to activism and sport. You described the events of last week as the fifth wave of sports activism.
Yes, I think that we all have to understand that this is not a one-off set of developments. This goes all the way back to the turn of the 20th century, when the first wave of athlete activism was actually established by a cyclist, world-class cyclist by the name of Major Taylor in 1896, the same year that the United States Supreme Court passed Plessy versus Ferguson, which made racial segregation a law of the land. Major Taylor that year was battling for the right to race in major events, cycling events in his own country. He could race in Europe, but he couldn't race in the United States. And so from the very outset, high-profile athletes, such as the first black superstar athlete, Major Taylor, have been in the forefront of the struggle against injustice and for human rights. And this goes right up, of course, through the next wave, which was Jackie Robinson and Larry Doby and those athletes who battled in the post-World War II era for access. And then the third wave, the black power athletes, Jim Brown, Bill Russell, Smith, and Carlos at the Olympics, of course, Arthur Ashe, Kurt Flood, and probably the leading athlete of that time in that regard, Muhammad Ali. And then a fourth wave, which was Kaepernick and that group who took a knee or otherwise protested against the extrajudicial murder of black and brown men, women, and children in this society at the hands of the police. And now we have entire teams, which marks the fifth wave of athlete activism. And this time, it's not just focused on the pain in black and brown communities. It's focused on the problems in the white mainstream that's responsible for that pain. So this is yet another wave of athlete activism, but it has a long history.
Relatively speaking, Wave 5 is very quick on the heels of Wave 4 compared to the other waves.
Well, they're all overlapping. You have factors that are dependent upon how it's framed ideologically. The first wave is probably the most lasting and extensive because up until really post-World War II America and President Truman's desegregation of the military, the desegregation of Major League Baseball, of professional football, and basketball in 1951 with Earl Lloyd, Sweetwater Clifton, and Chuck Cooper at Boston, and of course Brown versus Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas in 1954, which really a call for a desegregation of schools. You had going from that such movements as the Montgomery bus boycott led by Dr. King, which fought segregation in public transportation and public accommodations. And there were all kinds of struggles right up to 1964 and the Civil Rights Act in 1965 and the Voting Rights Act, which was supposed to universally guarantee constitutional rights to vote to all American citizens. So segregation was an extended set of circumstances that framed up these activities. After desegregation, you had a very quick succession of movements from the struggle for access, and of course the first thing we found out was that a lot of the access was predatory inclusion, including in the realm of sports. Black athletes were brought in because they were basically revenue producing. They were brought in principally in basketball and football, revenue producing sports, and politically relevant sports such as those that are involved in the Olympic Games. But black coaches, black managers, black owners coming out of the Negro Leagues that produce Willie Mays and Ernie Banks, Hank Aaron, and all of these great players, the owners and managers and coaches and so forth from the Negro Leagues were not brought in. The black coaches from the historically black schools that generated and developed so many great athletes were not brought in. So it was a predatory inclusion, and of course, with the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement, there were demands to change that predatory situation. So all of these circumstances are framed up and related to incidents in the broader society. These incidents, these circumstances come over the stadium wall. They come in through the locker room door, but in point of fact, they are inextricably intertwined with the conditions that athletes often find themselves in. As I stated in my 1970 dissertation at Cornell University, sports inevitably, unavoidably recapitulates society and the human and institutional relationships that prevail, as well as the ideological definitions that underpin and justify, rationalize those relationships. So it's inevitable that these outside society-wide circumstances would not only frame up, but interpenetrate, be intertwined with circumstances within the arena.
Harry, I mentioned at the outset you were the founder of the Olympic Project, and that culminated in the Black Power salute in 1968, Tommy Smith and John Carlos. Can you remember, did you feel like their message was understood by wider America at that time?
Well, I felt it was understood because the reaction was so universal. If it were not understood, you'd have reactions all over the place. But when reactions are typically on one trajectory of condemnation, then it's consistent with protest by people of color in American society going back to the time of enslavement. The reality is there's been a definitional struggle in this society that is integral to the struggle around racism, discrimination, injustice, and a violation of human rights. And that definitional struggle is rooted in the history of black and brown people in this society, of people of color, not being perceived by the white mainstream as creditable arbiters, creditable witnesses to their own circumstances and outcomes. And so if you go back to slavery, those who were enslaved said, "We want to be free." The slave master said, "My slaves are happy." If you go back to segregation, you had people like George Wallace and Orville Faubus and all of these people saying our Negroes were happy until those northern agitators came down. Well, the reality was that black people in the South who were being lynched, who were being discriminated against, who were being assaulted, were not satisfied with their circumstances. But there was a definitional struggle going on. And so Smith and Carlos were essentially saying that the America that we represent in the Olympic Games has to be better than black churches being bombed, than black leaders like Medgar Evers and Dr. King and so forth being shot down, than our schools being segregated, than us being discriminated against in job opportunities, than us being murdered by police in broad open daylight, black men, women, and children. That is what they were saying. And the argument was, no, that's not what it's about. You're disrespecting the anthem and the flag. The same consistent argument that was posed against Colin Kaepernick and the athletes who today are fighting those same issues. They're saying that we are better than 147 black men, women, and children being murdered every year since 1968 under cover of the badge. And what makes that 147 more critically important to focus on than the 3,000 or 4,000 murders that take place in the black community every year is that 147 undermines black community trust and confidence in the entire judicial system. And so they're reluctant to call in law enforcement, even with common everyday criminals, because the law enforcement might come out and kill them. I have a burglar alarm in my house, but if my burglar alarm goes off, in the community that I live in, where the average home is worth about $1.5 million, do you think I'm going to call the police? Absolutely no way. Because as soon as I get to the door and open it, and there's been a burglar alarm goes off, guess who they're likely to shoot as the burglar? So at the end of the day, this is the part of the wages of this violence, this police violence that is being protested now by activist athletes. And it was in large part the same, it is in large part the same definitional struggle that Smith and Carlos were up against in 1968. And by the way, that's why I advocated for a boycott. If you are sending out messages on a Twitter account or Instagram or email or text messaging and so forth, you're expressing sentiments. If you're protesting, you're making a statement. Carlos and Smith made a statement, which could be challenged definitionally. Kaepernick has made a statement. I've advocated a boycott, as the teams are now doing, because a boycott doesn't send out a message or express sentiments or make a statement. It sends a message to everyone. It doesn't express a sentiment or make a statement. It sends a message to everybody that's involved, ownership, sponsors, fans, everybody. You want to see your basketball? Then we have some demands we've got to make. So what I had posed was a boycott of the 68 Olympics, because I thought it was important at that point, at the point that Dr. King was murdered, that a message be sent to everybody involved, from the United States government down to the sponsors and networks and so forth who broadcast the Olympic Games. This time around, teams, NBA, Major League Soccer, Major League Baseball, the WNBA, Naomi Osaka and tennis and Serena, they are sending a message. This madness has to stop.
Were they close to a boycott in '68?
I think that there was so much arrayed against us. I knew that we were opposed, but it was not until I got my FBI dossier under the Freedom of Information Act, which as it turns out, was over 3,000 pages of dispatches, documents, lectures. They had informants in my classes where I was teaching, as well as my Cornell University dissertation, which was 1,104 pages long. Ultimately, it became the first integrated textbook in the sociology of sport, and a copy of the revolt of the black athlete. There's a broad array of stuff in there. But one of the things that I found out was that I was on J. Edgar Hoover's ADEX list, which meant these were cases that he handled personally. And when I got his checkoff sheet to where my information and documents went, I mean, it was from the State Department, CIA, to military defense, the FBI, of course, all local police jurisdictions where I might be lecturing or where I might be living or where I might be involved in some conference and what have you. It was not until I got my information from the Freedom of Information Act that I understood how broad and powerful the forces were allied against us. And this does not even get into the athletic interest. The NC2A, where 80% of Americans Olympians were developed, the United States Olympic Committee, and of course my old nemesis, the arch anti-Semite and racist Avery Brundage, did everything that he could to make sure that any athlete that was identified with the Olympic Project for Human Rights would be watched very, very carefully. So we had a chance, but a limited one, and still there were athletes who did boycott. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Lucius Allen, Mike Warren, most certainly Wes Unseld, Bob Lanier. A lot of athletes simply said, you know what, no, we got to send a message on this one, and they did. And I think to the extent that was not completely overrun and washed over by the counter information such as Kaepernick and these athletes are even up against today, they made a heck of a contribution.
Talk to us, Harry, about just how significant you think it is that this is not just now Kaepernick effectively on his own and consequently ostracised, but this is entire teams.
It's entire leagues. I mean, we're talking about Major League Baseball, Major League Soccer, we're talking about the NBA, we're talking about the NFL, and everybody knows that it's not over, that we're one extrajudicial murder at the hands of the police or at the hands of some other racist interest for this thing blows up altogether. The major difference is this. As I stated, Kaepernick was making a statement. He was protesting. He was demonstrating. He was making a statement. These athletes are boycotting. That is sending a message to all of the interest and stakeholders in terms of what they do as athletes. When you have baseball players coming out to the field before the game, then going back into the locker room and say, we're not going to play today. Hey, that's the television networks. That's the sponsors. That's the people who are sitting at home waiting on a game to start. That's the owners. That's the league. That's the other interests who have a stake in those games being played. And the same with the NBA, the same when Naomi Osaka decides she's not going to play a round of tennis, or Serena decides she's not going to play a round of tennis. All of these changes put pressure on stakeholders who really can make things happen. The owner of the Milwaukee, Wisconsin Brewers can pick up the phone and call the governor and say, hey, we got to bring an end to this because this is now come over the stadium wall and it's impacting not just me as the owner, it's impacting all the concessionaires, the hotels, the restaurants, and so forth that are involved here. So that is something that most certainly can have an impact. And I think that this change is reflective of that. This is a new era in terms of strategies and tactics going forward.
I know you had conversations with several NBA players Wednesday night, maybe Thursday morning as well, and a couple of coaches. What's the general sense of feeling you get from them? What advice did you give them? I'm sure they're looking for some kind of strategy going forward.
Well, they are involved in a very complicated set of circumstances. First, you have the confluence of four factors that they're trying to deal with. One is overarching, and that's the pandemic that has changed the very character and structure of sports organization and operation in American society today, and probably worldwide. Then you have in America the cratering of the economy owing to all of the layoffs and closures as a result of the pandemic. This has severely limited the discretionary dollar that people would be using to pay for tickets to sporting events or to buy subscriptions to televised sporting networks. Then you have a social justice movement, which is the largest protest movement in American history. It has enveloped everything, including sports. It's sitting right in their locker room, in their facilities, in their stadiums. And then, of course, you have what is probably the most consequential presidential election in this country since 1860, when Abraham Lincoln was elected president. The choices are that stark. And so all of that is now weighing down on these athletic enterprises, especially those where a majority, an overwhelming majority, 70 to 80% of the players that they put on the court or that they put on the field are black. It is weighing down on them because they know that they cannot separate out those athletes upon whom they are dependent as their sports product from the circumstances that those athletes are awakened to, and in point of fact that they share. LeBron James and Carmelo Anthony and Chris Paul and all of these great athletes know that the only reason it was George Floyd that a cop was leaning on with his knee instead of them was that they were not there. And so they are very much involved in this in a deeply personal fashion because of their own personal interest, because of the interest of their families, of their sisters, their brothers, their sons and daughters, their mothers and fathers, any one of whom could end up like Rayshard Brooks or Jacob Blake or Breonna Taylor. They are aware of that. And so these coaches who are overwhelmingly white, these owners who are overwhelmingly white, facing boycotts by these athletes over these issues, have to figure out a way. How do we get on the same page as our players? Because they are the foundation of this entire enterprise. Nobody's going to come to watch the owners play basketball in the NBA. Nobody's going to come to watch the owners play baseball in the Major League Baseball leagues or soccer or football. And so they have to figure out a way for the first time, probably in their ownership, how do we get on the same page with, be supportive of, in point of fact, out in front of our athletes in these complicated and complex times. This is while they're trying to deal with a pandemic which has already killed almost 185 Americans, is projected to kill somewhere in the vicinity of 200 to 300,000 Americans by the end of the year. And it is the people who are being killed, the age group is moving down because there's such a so much broader swath of infections. And so they've got to wrestle with that. You cannot have social distancing in football. It is difficult to have social distancing in basketball. But that is what they have to deal with, or they have to shut down completely. Then they have another problem. When do we open up? Because the body count is going to continue to go up. If we close down now, will we ever be able to open up again within the next 2 to 5 years maybe? How do we manage this? And they are not in the pandemic business. They are not in the endemic business, because there's every likelihood that this situation, this pandemic, could become like the common cold or the normal flu, principally because we have never in human history eradicated but one viral disease, and that was smallpox. Everything else, polio, Ebola, the flu, the common cold, is still out there, and we try to vaccinate against it or come up with symptomology that will allow us to relieve some of the symptoms of it. But this is a killer. The basketball coaches and football owners and so forth, they're not in the public health business, but they're trying to work with this. And so we have had all kinds of discussions about what do we do, where do we turn, who do we believe, and, of course, the madness coming out of Washington, D.C., the sewerisms and denialisms relative to this pandemic are not helping the issue at all. We need a national policy. Otherwise, it's everybody on their own, not just every state, but every team. And that's a very dangerous situation where teams are playing each other.
Okay. If you're just tuned in, we're talking to Dr. Harry Edwards. Do you anticipate they'll get specific in their demands? It will be about specifics when it comes to police reforms. Is that how this all culminates?
Oh, yeah, that has already happened. The Baltimore Ravens have put out a, I think, very insightful, very doable list of demands that go from federal laws that will eliminate some of the latitude that local prosecutors have in terms of charging and trying police officers who are caught on tape murdering citizens. It also goes down to some of the other issues of injustice, such as the extraordinarily disproportionate rate of traffic stops in communities of color, which, because so many people who are stopped are unable to pay the fines, these turn into arrest warrants, which become confrontational situations after a period of time and actually generate police-citizen confrontations in these communities. So there are a whole list of demands that have been developed, and other teams and interests are working on still others that they can go forward with in the wake of the upcoming election, assuming that there's a change in D.C. And at the local level, if we're only talking about changes in down-ballot candidates and options. I think also that people like Chris Paul and LeBron James, who reached out to the president, not this guy in D.C., but President Barack Obama, and asked for his advice, made a very wise move, because he also came up with some suggestions in terms of voter registration, organization, mobilization around the upcoming elections, not just in terms of the presidential part of the ballot, but downrange issues, propositions, and candidates who may have a greater impact in terms of dealing with this extrajudicial killing, arrests, and so forth, than could ever come out of Washington, D.C. in a timely fashion. So there are a lot of things in the mix. Everybody's trying to wrap their mind around it, while at the same time they're saddled with how do we function, quote, normally, unquote, in this pandemic situation.
It's never a universal response when it comes to sports people. I was curious if you have any insight into Tiger Woods, or if you'd spoken to Tiger Woods previously, because Milwaukee made their decision on the Wednesday night, and on Thursday morning, probably the greatest golfer in the history of the game, who just so happens to be African Asian and, you know, plays the current president's sport, and it is the sport of white America and the country clubs. I was interested to see, would he make any demonstration on Thursday? Might he take a knee? Might he even boycott the event, which was certainly not a career-defining event for him? And we have never heard much from Woods in that department, next to nothing. And he's now in his mid-40s. You know, this is not a new kid on the scene, maybe struggling to grapple with his status or how to behave. He must know himself and know his thoughts at this stage. Has Woods ever approached you for advice or thoughts? Have you ever heard what his thinking is?
I've talked to him in the past. I've talked to Tiger in the past. I haven't heard anything from him. I'm not looking to hear anything from him as far as I'm concerned. With this movement, he's irrelevant, and I think that we should just move on. I mean, there's nothing there that's going to have any impact. Nothing that he could say would be believable. Nothing that he could do would be creditable. Nothing that he could contribute would be worth very much. And in point of fact, nobody expects anything. So at this late date, who cares? No, I haven't heard anything from him. Not looking to hear anything from him, and I don't know anybody else who is either. He's irrelevant.
Okay. There is an interesting point in all of this when it comes to the technology side of things, and I want to know if you, like, where sport potentially has the potential to have a bigger role. So increasingly we're told that it is a human tendency when it comes to the media that we're following, that we tend to follow a news agenda that we all agree with. You know, if you're a Sean Hannity fan, you can get Sean Hannity on your timeline and very little else. And arguably sport, given that, you know, everybody supports a team regardless of politics in the main, your sporting hero forcing you to confront some truths is one of the few ways you might hear something different to the echo chamber you've created for yourself. That's a very, I mean, that gives it maybe even more power than it ever had in some respects.
Well, the thing that gives this whole movement power, and why it would not have been possible in the late 1960s during the era of the Olympic Project for Human Rights, much less going back to Jackie Robinson breaking the color line in baseball, is the social media. In 1968, if I wanted to communicate with 100 people, I would have to get on my rotary telephone, dial each one of them up, There was no answering service, so I would have to hope that I would be around when 50 of them called back. And after talking to them for some short period of time, hopefully 20 of them wouldn't think that I was totally insane, and maybe 10 of them would say, hey, you know, what can I do to help? But today, athletes and other people involved in this protest movement can simply go online, input their message, link it up through their Instagram or text messaging or email list or Twitter account, and hit the single most powerful word in any language in human history, SEND. And all of a sudden, it goes out to millions of people. They send it out to all of their contacts, and before you know it, it's like Colin Kaepernick. You have 10, 12, 15, 20 million people who are tuning into your perspective on this. From that perspective, how many people watches Hannity doesn't matter. He's just another news talking head that people listen to. But as long as these superstar athletes utilize their platform and that phenomenal megaphone afforded them by the social media, they will be able not only to compete with, but to counter alternative definitions of the situation. Now, will you have those individuals who, I don't care how much logic, I don't care how urgent the situation, I don't care how much you catch extrajudicial murders on camera, they are going to go with the alt-right perspective and definition of what's going on, of what has happened. They were not going to listen one way or another, whether we were in the era of rotary phones or in the era of instant mass communication through text message and Twitter accounts. So that's just the opposition.
Yeah.
The thing that you have to do is to get it out to the world, that this is what's going on here. Here's the evidence. You, a rational individual, look at it and tell us what you think. And the next question is, what can you do to help us clean this mess up?
Yeah. The other point, I know what you're saying about the opposition will be the opposition regardless of evidence, but if we're talking technology as well, you know, you mentioned that minorities were not considered credible witnesses. When it comes to something like George Floyd or Jacob Blake, certainly looking, you know, the world looking on, it's irrefutable evidence before our eyes. You know, it's not, well, the police officer said this and gave this impression of what happened, and, you know, the alleged victim said something different, and it's very hard for us who weren't there to deduce what happened. I mean, suddenly it's technology, it's videoed, it's around the world in seconds, everybody can see what's happened. So
well,
that notion of credible witnesses or not being credible witnesses, that is a thing of the past now in so many instances.
No, it depends. You know, if you want to look at an example that kind of gets us away from the urgency and all of the emotion of these extrajudicial murders, look at the schools in America, the colleges and universities that decided to play football this fall and the ones that didn't. They're all looking at the same scientific facts. These are educators. These are people on their campuses in their biology and immunology and other departments who are advising them on what steps the university should take, whether they should open at all. But yet, you come up with some schools that open and have football this fall, others that don't. And if you look at the big Power 5 conferences, for example, in America, you have the Pac-12, which is Washington down the West Coast into parts of Arizona, including you have UCLA, USC, Cal, Stanford, these schools, and you have the Big Ten, which is largely upper Midwest, Ohio, Michigan, Illinois, Iowa, and so forth. They are not playing football this fall. But you have another set of schools, beginning with the Big 12, which is Oklahoma, Oklahoma State, Baylor, Texas, TCU, swinging over into Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Mississippi State, Alabama, Auburn, Georgia, swinging up the East Coast to Florida State, North Carolina, South Carolina, Duke, and so forth. You don't have to be Sherlock Holmes or Robert E. Lee to connect those dots. What you're essentially looking at are a group of so-called red states that are looking through a political prism that is denying the virus and its impact, who have no mask mandates from their governors in those states, and who essentially buy into the notion that the urgency of this pandemic is a left-wing media hysteria put together and promoted in order to threaten the re-election of the guy sitting up in the Oval Office. That is what, do you connect those dots? That is essentially the Old South. That's deep red Trump territory, whereas other conferences have a predominance of states that have at least mandated mask wearing, that do not see this pandemic as a left-wing hoax. So when you have the same facts, but you go to not just different but contradictory definitions and outcomes relative to the choices to be made, you can't look at the facts anymore. You can't look at the fact that there was one response when Kaepernick took a knee against injustice, and in that same camp, there was a different response when a cop took a knee on a black man's neck in living color at prime time until he was dead, and say, well, the facts are clear. Well, the facts are never clear. It depends upon what prism that they're looking through. So this war over definitional authority has never been higher. It has never been more germane. So far from being a factor of the past, it is more urgent now that we engage that struggle over definitional authority because the outcomes involved are so critical.
A last point then, where does this fifth wave take us in the short term? I'm talking over the next year or two. Where do you see things going? Like, will there be more boycotts when there are further incidents, for instance? Do you anticipate that?
Well, I think that what we're looking at is something that I stated in 1968 when a reporter asked me what difference did I think that the Smith-Carlos protests would make if Jackie Robinson breaking the color line didn't have a final, didn't bring a final resolution to this whole issue of developments at the interface of sport and society. And my response was that our circumstances are dynamic and diverse. Our struggle, therefore, has to be multifaceted and perpetual, and there are no final victories. The outcomes of this situation with this fifth wave of boycott efforts, not protest efforts, not texting, emailing, Instagramming, and Twittering efforts where sentiments are expressed, not protest efforts where statements are made, but boycott efforts where messages are sent to all stakeholders that we're going to stop business as usual until you apply your assets to help us resolve this issue. This will not be the final victory. Just as surely as other circumstances will emerge, there will be other waves of athlete activism because sport and society are inextricably intertwined. Sport recapitulates society, and there will always be these struggles coming over the stadium wall, in through the gymnasium turnstiles, and you will have athletes who will be activists in response to that because of that intertwined outcome that they all face with the communities that they come from. And then there are those black and white athletes who sincerely believe that part of the American Constitution that begins with we the people. It doesn't say we the Congress, or we the legislators, or we the judges, or we the mayors, or we the governors. It most certainly doesn't say we the presidents, and it doesn't say we the people, with the exception of athletes. They see themselves as having a fundamental responsibility to use their platforms, to use their tremendous megaphone, to do everything in their power to meet that mandate of we the people to form that more perfect union. And that's black athletes and white athletes, and I think that that is going to continue.
Okay, well, it's great to hear your thoughts on it all. Dr. Harry Edwards, thanks very much.
Thank you so much. I hope it was worth your time.